Hey folks, Storm here with another figure for you guys. This one here is from Elden Ring, if you've ever played that video game. And we're going to be doing something different today because I've never actually painted a horse before, but it definitely fits the theme of the fantasy realm. So we're going to go ahead and try to do that today, and I'm going to show you exactly how we can show off all these details using all sorts of different figure painting techniques. Even though this isn't a small scale miniature, we can still use those same techniques to make a large scale model. And what we're going to do is make her go from looking like this, a beautiful gray print, to something like this. There are so many details to unpack here, including some realistic leather on Torrent. So why don't we unpack these, shall we? So just like in any good sculpture, we start with our 3D resin print, which I printed this on a Saturn III Ultra, soon to be the Saturn IV Ultra and the GK3, whenever that shows up at my doorstep. Definitely look forward to seeing those pieces of equipment on my bench. But anyway, I digress. Let's get back to painting. So, as I normally do this, I start with a black primer. This is nothing new. Anyone who's watched my channel before, you know I almost always start with black primer, and the reason I choose black primer is because it works great for creating shadows and stuff, especially when you do techniques like dry brushing, as we're going to do here on this base. What I'm going to do is start by dry brushing this ground with earth tones. I started with a grayish color to kind of bring out the rocks and stuff, and then I'm spraying it with earth tones out of my airbrush. And what that's doing is essentially working like a pre-shade and then the earth tone shade over top of it. And the next thing I did was come in with some darker tones to fill in the gaps between these cobblestones, and also to kind of act like shadows there for where Torrent's going to be standing. So then after that, I wanted to paint these cobblestones, but I didn't want them to just look flat. So I'm going to use more dry brushing, which I'm really falling in love with this technique. And I understand some experienced artists might say that dry brushing is too easy, or whatever excuse they want to use to justify not using it. Listen, this is a technique that's in your arsenal if you've learned it. If you haven't, learn it. This is a great technique you can learn for beginners, and the results are amazing. They're eye-catching. They're just really good. So don't let anybody talk you out of dry brushing because it's too easy or what have you. All I'm doing is dry brushing different tones of grays and earth tones, like light tan colors, to create this cobblestone effect. And you can see how it actually brings out the details of those cobblestones. So moving on to the first figure, we're going to paint Melina first. You can see what I'm doing is I'm using my reference photos that the artist gave us to get my zenithal highlighting down. So I'm making sure I'm only putting highlights in areas where the light's actually going to be hitting our character. And again, you can see I'm doing this from the top down over top of the black. This is why I use black as my primer coat, because if you start with gray or white, you won't get these dramatic contrasts. Now the next thing we're going to do is spray these boots with a leather brown. Nothing fancy here, we're just spraying over it, but as you can tell, what I'm actually doing is still spraying from the top down, as so I don't cover up those shadows that we created during the zenithal phase. The next step is to go into the detailing, which you can see here. I just took a lighter shade of brown to go over these threads that are on her boots, and what I tried to do is drag my brush over the top. It's very similar to a dry brushing technique, but the idea is that you don't get the paint into the crevices of the threads, and what it does is it actually makes them look like they're a little bit bigger, like it gives them volume. Remember, that's why we want the black primer base. That's why we don't need to cover every single inch of our model with the color paint that we're trying to paint. I've seen so many artists just blast a solid color of paint over top of their models, and what you're doing is you're losing the shadows that the primer coat that you put down is offering you. So remember, you don't need to paint your model completely. For the completionists out there, it's okay if there's a little bit of that black showing in the shadows. That's what you want. You want that effect. You can see what I'm doing here is I actually added some brown shadows into this part of her skirt because I wasn't happy with the results. Again, because it was hard to not cover up the black because it's such a flat piece. And then again, you can see I'm doing the same thing as I did on her boots. I'm taking some lighter tones and I'm going over those threads, but I'm trying to only do the edges of the threads so it gives it that 3D look. Same thing with this little rope that's there for her belt. You can see how it actually looks like it has a little bit more depth because we're not just painting every single piece of this. We're not painting all the crevices. This is what I was saying about how we can take what our miniature figure painters do and apply it to even these larger scales on these small details. As you can see here, I'm only painting the edges, or at least I'm doing my best to try to do that. And how you do that is by thinning your paint out, but not too thin, and using things like flow improver or paint retarder. That way you don't get runny paint, but you actually get a thick paint. Like a glaze medium would really help with that too. So after I had painted up her clothing there, I'm working on her cloak, and you can see I really went crazy with the contrast here, maybe a little too crazy, but the idea was to show those deep folds. I actually tried using black ink to make those shadows in the folds, and I thought it was a little dramatic, but at the same time that's what I was going for, was the contrast. So there's not a lot of skin tone on Melina, so as you can see here, I'm still using my same formula that I've been using. It's essentially pink from the top to start, and any kind of like dark red or dark purple color from below to kind of create some undertones, and then I go over top of it with some flesh colors. So I don't always use exactly the same paints, but I typically use Vallejo's Fairy Flesh set, but I've actually started using AK's Flesh set because I found that the paint colors, there's a little bit more variety in what I can use there, and I actually like their darker tones a little bit better. So I actually have started using some more AK tones for the flesh. So here you can see I'm just using like a reddish flesh for her lips. Nothing crazy here that you guys haven't seen already on my other videos, but if you haven't seen my other videos, I'll leave all the links in the description to all my past sculptures so you can see those. There's a lot more skin tone examples back there, but you can see it still looks really good. And her hair, there's a little bit underneath her hood. It is a reddish color, so that's exactly what I used here, which is like a reddish color to paint the edges. Now what I did was I tried to paint the edges a little bit brighter than the up inside, so I think she turned out really good. I put her on the base, and then I moved on to Torrent, and in this case I just left the black primer to start, and I actually went over with a dark gray to create highlights. So again, taking advantage of the black primer base. Now this is the part that probably everyone wants to see. The leather that I made is really simple. You have to start with a black primer base. I cannot stress that enough. Then I'm using a rust color and dry brushing over top of that texture that our artist gave us. As you can see here, as I'm also dry brushing his hair, you'll see that it brings out the leather texture that the artist actually put into this model. Then what I'm doing is I'm taking leather brown paint and very thin layers over top of that orange dry brush that we put down. And what that's doing is the black is creating the shadows and the orange is creating the highlights, and then we're spraying on the mid-tone. That's what pre-shading is for. Pre-shading is for creating highlights and shadows for you to then take advantage of when you spray over the base coat. And what I did then for all the other parts of leather, like these straps for that go up to the front of the horse, in this case, I used a little jig I had made out of paper so I could spray and still get that even look, because if you just brush paint over top of the dry brushing, it'll cover too much because it'll be too opaque. You won't be able to see through it. So you can see here I'm just using the same exact method for the bags on the side, and I used a very similar method but with different colors for that bag on the back of the of Torrent there. So realistic leather textures are totally doable. I mean, it stands up to the up close. Take a look for yourself as I'm painting this little rope hanging off here. Those textures look so realistic, even up close, because it's a simple formula. There's nothing complex to it, and this artist gave us a great canvas, if you will, to paint on. So again, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's just simple 3 steps to make that realistic leather. After that, I had some more detail painting to put onto Torrent, like these silver pieces here on his straps, and there's plenty of silver pieces. I didn't realize how much there was. There's a ton of silver pieces to paint over this. Don't mind my hand getting in the way. That happens all the time. But here you can see what Torrent looks like when he's all done. So many little details, but that leather is so eye-catching. Really, Torrent, I think, was like the main part of this base more so than Melina was. But with that, guys, that's the whole base done. Really quick, really simple, really easy. Listen, you can do this. You all can do this. You can paint like this. It's not overly difficult. You can get really good results without having to spend weeks on a project like this. So just keep practicing, keep printing, keep painting, keep building, just keep doing it, and it will start to click. It will start to make sense. You can do this. Beautiful results are achievable. Just keep going at it. So I want to take this moment to say thank you to my patrons. If you're interested in adding a model like this to your collection, please check out my store at relentlessstormmodels.com. Use code STORMYT2024 to get 10% off your order. Perhaps you're not a painter and you just like to add these to your collection, and I can definitely help you out with that. So again, head on over to my website at relentlessstormmodels.com. I'm also available on eBay and Etsy, but I'd prefer if you used my website just because it makes things easier for me. Let's make it a good day.